Hi guys, I'm Dan with Fort Meigs Historic Site. Behind me stands the Fort Meigs Monument, a large obelisk in the center of the reconstructed fort. It stands as a tribute to the men that lived, fought, and died here over 200 years ago. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it, as well as the other monuments and markers scattered around the property. So be sure to stay tuned, there's more coming right up. The War of 1812 ended in 1815, and when it did, Fort Meigs was abandoned. By the middle of the 19th century, three brothers had purchased the land the old fort had occupied. Their names were Michael, Timothy, and Thomas Hayes. The Hayes family would own the property for the rest of the century. Mindful of the events that took place on their property, the Hayes brothers refused to farm the land where the fort once stood. Instead, they plowed the area just south of the fort proper. It said they actually used the fort's old defensive earthworks as fencing for their cattle. Because of their dedication, the Hayes brothers are considered the first preservationists of Fort Meigs Historic Site, and the Hayes Rock stands in the Memorial Garden as tribute to their work. At the turn of the 20th century, the state of Ohio, under the guidance of the Fort Meigs Commission, purchased 36 acres from the Hayes family for historic preservation. The transaction took place on June 12, 1907, at the cost of $10,800. A contract was let in September of that year for the construction of the Grand Obelisk to mark the historic grounds. The total cost for the monument was $14,000, and it was dedicated a year later on September 1, 1908. Dedication ceremonies were led by the Fort Meigs Commission, and guests included members of the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternity of Civil War veterans who were holding a reunion in nearby Toledo, Ohio that week. The Fort Meigs Monument was rededicated on its centennial anniversary by Fort Meigs staff and volunteers. Attendees included local citizens as well as representatives from all levels of government. John Wilson, chairman of the Fort Meigs Commission, said at the original dedication, "Although it is nearly a century since the great drama that fixed their fame as patriots and heroes, and as our benefactors, we have the happy privilege of proving that we are not forgetful or ungrateful, and that their fame, preserved in history and tradition, did not die with their generation, but has lived to inspire this generation with the liveliest emotions of love and gratitude. And we are glad today to dedicate this beautiful shaft of enduring granite erected by the state of Ohio to the heroic and patriotic services of the men of 1813 who consecrated these grounds." About 1923, a second monument was built on the site. This monument, funded by the state of Pennsylvania, was a tribute to the men of that state who fell at Fort Meigs. Members of the Pennsylvania militia, as well as volunteer troops known as the Pittsburgh Blues, fought and died at the fort. 80 of those men still lie where they were buried, and the Pennsylvania Monument sits in the center of their cemetery. May 5, 1813 marked the heaviest day of fighting at Fort Meigs, where over 700 members of the Kentucky militia were killed or captured in what became known as Dudley's Defeat. In 2013, on the bicentennial of that day, a new monument was unveiled, this one to the men of Kentucky who served at Fort Meigs during the War of 1812. The Virginia Monument was erected in 2015 at the end of the bicentennial of the war. It stands as a marker for all the sons of Virginia who fell at Fort Meigs and throughout Ohio during the War of 1812. The Kentucky and Virginia monuments stand alongside the Hayes Rock near the Fort Meigs Memorial Garden. They are all located at the site of the largest graveyard on the property. While we do not know how many people died at Fort Meigs, current estimates place the burials at the main cemetery between 150 and 300 men. In addition to the large cemeteries, historic accounts tell us there are at least several men buried within the fort walls. Those men include Major Amos Stoddard, who was wounded by shrapnel from an exploding bomb on the first day of the first siege. He died from tetanus 11 days later, and was buried in front of the Grand Battery, where he was commanding at the time he was wounded. Additionally, a lone gravestone sits at the edge of the Grand Parade Field, noting it as the final resting place of Lieutenants Robert Walker and John McCullough. Robert Walker was killed by Native Americans on March 9, 1813, while out hunting ducks along the Maumee River. He was shot, tomahawked, and scalped, and his body was stuffed under the ice of the river. Several days later, a search party found him, and he was buried somewhere on the Grand Parade Field. Curiously, no known records could confirm John McCullough's being at Fort Meigs at all, so the information on the tombstone he shares with Robert Walker may be incorrect. It is one of the many lasting mysteries Fort Meigs still holds on to this day. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about the monuments and markers here at Fort Meigs Historic Site. If you do have any questions, drop those in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again real soon.